Welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. This fall, we will continue our program with the some events taking place in our building. You will be able to see announcements of upcoming programs on Society's website, Facebook, and Instagram. Our next event will be the book launch, Battleground Ukraine from Independence to the War with Russia by Adrian Karatnitsky on November 9th. Today we have a book launch of Carols of Birds, Bells, and Sacred Hymns from Ukraine, an anthology and cultural companion by Dr. Marika Kuzma. This book was published with the financial support of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the USA. I'm honored to say that the discussant of this presentation will be His Excellency Metropolitan Archbishop Boris Budzyak. And I'm very happy to give the floor to the moderator, Dr. Maria Sonevitsky.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. We're so excited to be here celebrating this brilliant new book, this publication, which I hope you will get a chance to see and get your hands on and dig into today. So it is my great honor to present Dr. Marika Kuzma, who, as you likely know, is an internationally renowned conductor, chorus master, and scholar who has performed everywhere from Weill Recital Hall at Carnegie to the Stephansdom in Vienna, to Zellerbach Hall in Berkeley, California, where she also directed choirs for some 25 years, having retired as Professor Emerita from the University of California, Berkeley, which then led her back to the East Coast, which we're just so happy has happened. I'm not sure ever really properly overlapped at Berkeley per se, because Dr. Kuzma retired the year that I began, I think, but we were briefly sort of in that same milieu in California as well. So my name is Maria Sonevitsky. I'm a professor of anthropology and music / ethnomusicology at Bard College, and I thought I might just say a word about the book, but before I do that, I want to tell you what to expect with the event today. So after I finish my introductory word, Dr. Kuzma will present about the book a little bit, and we'll get to hear some of the amazing choral music featured as well, which I'm really looking forward to. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. So I have questions ready, and I know that His Excellency also has questions ready, and then we will open the floor to Q&A. So that's the rough plan for how the event will run. So Carols of Birds, Bells, and Sacred Hymns from Ukraine is the title of this marvelous achievement of scholarship. It is a really profoundly researched book, and I have to say it is both a kind of deeply historical work and also a very precise musicological work that digs very specifically into these musical materials, sometimes dating back 1,000 years on the territory now known as Ukraine. The subtitle of the book is an anthology and cultural companion, and it really is both. It accompanies us through the long sweep of the complexities of Ukrainian history and narrates and punctuates along the way how choral music was always present, always accompanying people, especially through these winter rituals and winter sacred practices that have morphed and changed over time, but still define much of Ukrainian choral music today. The second part of the book actually reproduces scores edited and prepared by Dr. Kuzma, so you literally get the notation in the book as well, which is an incredible resource and will be an incredible resource for future generations. So without further ado, I will pass the mic back to you, and we will get to hear some of these marvelous musical examples.
Дуже дякую. I must say, this feels very surreal for me to be sitting next to these two titans in Ukrainian scholarship and the ecclesiastical world. And I wanted to say, in case I don't get the chance later on, thank you for everything. The monumental work you've been doing for Ukraine. It is nedopodumania. It's one can hardly fathom everything these two individuals have done. So again, it feels surreal to be here. I thank you for your presence, and I thank you for the introduction. So without further ado, the book. I'll just start by saying that this book is unusual, and I will grant you that. Most books on music are either compendiums of scores with lots of lines, lots on them. And this is one such book. It's called the Oxford Book of Carols, which is a huge resource to choral directors around the world. So that's one type of book. The other type about, and these books typically are mainly music manuscript, and then sometimes they have little notations about music history or composers' lives, but the bulk of it really is a score. And then you have, by contrast, books about the history of music, and they typically have just a few measures here and there sprinkled through. Well, this book is both. It is, my notes here, it is 190 pages of music history and 192 pages of music score. I didn't actually map it out that way, but after I got it back from the typesetter, it was an even split, which is quite remarkable. The scores include 26 pieces of music by 15 composers. They span about 300 years, from old chant to contemporary pieces, and they include liturgical chants and hymns and two genres of carols. Or I must say that the distinction of genres is a little blurry, but it includes the kolyatki, which are roughly carols that are of more sacred nature, and at least the ones that I include here are more biblical text, and szczedrivke, and those are the carols that are more secular nature, more related to the beauty and the bounty of nature. So this book has a representation of all of them and 300 pages worth of that. And then there are the 190 pages of information about the music's history, biographies of composers, and about the different genres and rituals that surround the carols. You might say that this book also reflects my dual nature and my life, in that I've been mainly a performing musician, but I've also been involved in scholarship, and I have published articles in a book. And I've always felt that the two practices inform each other, and you can't have one without the other. I don't know how many publishers in the world would accept this kind of a project, and so I'm profoundly grateful to Cambridge Scholars Publishing for taking on this project and for allowing me to nitpick every page with every note and accent mark and piano marking. And I'm also very grateful to the Shevchenko Scientific Society for supporting this project. For those of you visiting today for the first time, this is a very august institution. It's been in existence since the 1870s. And so I am very honored to be part of this legacy, part of this lineage. I'm also grateful to the libraries that I have, and librarians who've been so helpful. Because of the war in Ukraine, initially I thought, I started this book before the war erupted in its full force, and I thought I could go into research, but then I couldn't, or at least I would say I was too chicken to go to Kiev to sit in libraries there. And so the librarians, both in Ukraine, Canada, and the US, have been extremely helpful and generous. This book is unusual, but it's also necessary. If you go to music libraries outside of Ukraine, you will see stacks and stacks of books devoted to the history of German music, British music, Russian music, and then you'll see half of a shelf for Ukrainian music. And of those books on those shelves, perhaps two will be in English. And so there is so little information accessible. And this really hit me hard again when I was researching this book and couldn't go to Ukraine. And I would be looking for basic biographies of big composers, and I found nothing. And so that very much motivated my work and how much I had to roll up my sleeves. If you look in the Oxford Book of Carols, you will see centuries worth of carols from all the Western European countries, from Poland, from the Czech Republic, and not a single one from Ukraine, which is ironic because Ukraine has thousands of them. And also one of the most ubiquitous carols in the world that we hear every Christmas season, whether we want to or not, is the Carol of the Bells by Leontovich. So again, this motivated me to produce this book. I felt called to make this unusual book because in a way I'm in a unique position. I'm mostly a performer and also a scholar, and those practices inform each other. I am both from the inside of this culture because I was born to parents who were immigrants from Ukraine. My first language was Ukrainian. The first songs I sang were in Ukrainian. But from pretty much 8th grade on, I immersed myself in Western European music. And I went to music schools, gained degrees from North Carolina, Indiana, Stanford University, Vienna Conservatory. And so my focus was mainly in music of European composers and American composers, although I always included some Ukrainian music when I was working in UC Berkeley. So I'm from both cultures, and this is, I think, very useful because I've spent my life translating one culture to another. Literally, I've translated these carols for students in UC Berkeley and in Montreal and in Virginia. And I'm also in a position where I think I can make connections that perhaps people from only one side or the other cannot. I can bridge these things, I think, perhaps in a way that others can't. For example, when I was looking at the biography of Sitsenko, this marvelous book by Lou Parchomenko, his biography, it just said, okay, and he composed these 50 arrangements of carols and published them and in between 1907 and 1910. And I just started transcribing that onto my laptop. And then I thought, 50? And then this book said at least 50, if not 100, because so many of them were lost. And I thought, what other composer do I know of worldwide who has arranged 50 to 100 carols? Germany, no. England, no. America, no. So this in and of itself is remarkable. And I'm not sure that you would have found that in a computer search. So this is part of the reason why I felt motivated to write this book. In Ukraine, there's this saying, "Vizme izrobe." So I took it and I did it. I can't claim to be the biggest expert on Ukrainian choral music because I'm not immersed in it the way people in Ukraine are. But I felt I'm going to make a stab at it and do the best I can. The book is unusual in that it's sort of it's both history and scores, but it's also appropriate because Ukraine's choral music, I think, is uniquely, has a unique interweaving of history and music making. There's a lot to explore and explain about Ukraine's carols and Christmas music. Even a seemingly simple carol like the famous Carol of the Bells has a lot embedded within it. And you all know it if I have to explain it. Hark you the bells, sweet silver bells. In its original Ukrainian version, Shtedrik isn't about bells at all. It's about a bird, a lastivochka, that flies into a farmer's yard to remind him of all that he has. He has grain, he has sheep, he has a beautiful wife. And I'm always grateful for that the bird reminds him that he has a nice wife. So the gist of the song is about gratitude, about bounty, and about generosity. It's called Shtedrik because it belongs to a genre called Shtedrivke. And Shtedrivke aren't sung on Christmas per se, but on a holiday called Shtedri Večer, a celebration of gratitude and generosity. And in Ukraine, it's celebrated either on New Year's Eve or on Theophany Eve, depending on the region you're from. The lyrics and the simple motive of the original carol likely come from an era in Ukraine when New Year's was celebrated not at the winter solstice, but at the advent of spring. After all, the lastivochka, a swallow, is a harbinger of spring. So the carol immediately, there's a lot to explain about it. You know, Carol of the Bells, well, it's not about bells. it's not a Christmas carol. No, it's not even for winter time, but we sing it anyway. So it's not something that you can explain in a little program note or talking to an audience unless they have an hour to spend with you to unpack all that. And what I've just shared doesn't even take into account the biography of its composer, Mykola Leontovich, his humble beginnings as the son of a priest in a small village, his life's work as a priest, music teacher, ethnographer, political activist, or his tragic end at the hands of a Russian secret agent assassin. It also doesn't yet take into account how this very carol became an international sensation in the 1920s during a tour of the Ukrainian National Choir that sold out concert halls in this very city and stadiums across Europe and the Americas. Ukraine's president at the time, Simon Petlura, this was during a brief period when Ukraine was independent, sent out this choir along with this carol on a tour around the world to convince Europe and the world and the delegates at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference that Ukraine was legitimate, that it was an actual people, that they deserved to have their sovereignty. Who does that? Who sends a choir with little carols to tell Europe to give us our land? But Ukraine did that. And then there's also the music analysis of that carol. This carol was so popular that one music critic, when it performed in Berlin, called Stadrik Ukrainian musical hashish, because it was so addictive. And what is it within this music that makes it so addictive? So I also spent some time in my book describing an analysis. It's not just, that the tune is cute, it's what Leontovich did with it, and it's useful to look at what he did with it. So there's a lot to explore in each carol in this anthology. And in writing and compiling this book, I felt like I couldn't just serve up 26 carols in a book as if you would be serving up hors d'oeuvres on a platter and say, here, enjoy. I really wanted to go through the ingredients of each one. And to mix another metaphor, I think of each carol as sort of a prism through which you can understand Ukraine as a whole, its history, its people, and its spirit. The carols are by and large short. Stadrik is only 2 minutes long. There's a Kozycki carol in here that clocks in at about 45 seconds. But nevertheless, no matter how long or short, there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of information, and they're sort of like, to use another metaphor, a Ukrainian pisanka. It's a miniature, and yet there's so much there. So I decided to take the time and the pages to explore all of that. Now, the juxtaposition of this repertoire and its history sometimes seems very dissonant. When I was writing this book, I sent the history chapter to several colleagues, and one of them was my mentor in graduate school, a famous, very well-known choral director. And I said, well, what do you think of this history chapter? And he wrote back, he said, Marika, how can you do this to us? You lure us in with this catchy title, Carols of Birds, Bells, and Sacred Hymns, and then there's all this tragic history. I mean, you can't do that. And my response is, I have to, because you can't erase or sanitize or put some tinsel on Ukraine's history, not even the history of its carols. So when I was writing the book, I found myself taking breaks, just leaving the house, taking walks, and because I needed to cry, and because I needed to breathe a lot. And I would say to myself on these walks, I would murmur to myself, as authors sometimes do, and I would say, Marika, for God's sake, you're writing about carols, you're not writing about gulags. And yet, unfortunately, the biographies of some of these composers do include exile and gulags. So I took breaths. And within the text here, within the prose, I also take some breaths, which is also a little bit unorthodox, but I felt it was necessary. So when I'm going through the narration of the history, sometimes I just press pause and quote some lyrics from a carol or from a liturgical text so that the reader, just the way I did, the reader has a chance to take a breath and exhale. I think this is also appropriate because these carols, in a sense, have served as the deep breaths, the pauses for Ukrainians amid their tragic history. They are the deep breaths, they are the inspiration for them amid difficult times. And also these vibrant, uplifting carols have enabled them to survive. So I like to think of this book as being both documentation and celebration. I give these carols the same scrutiny and documentation that I would give, that are given to each carol in the Oxford Book of Carols, and I give them each the respect and love that the world gives to Bach cantatas and Verdi operas. There's a moment when I was writing with the librarian in Kiev, Ludmila Rudenko, who's wonderful, and I kept insisting, isn't there a primary source for this carol? Can't you find, isn't there something there? And I think she was getting annoyed with me, frankly, and saying, well, it's, you can find it in any church choir loft. Why do you? And then I wrote her, I said, no, I wrote a critical edition of Botniansky. I've written articles about Brahms and Stravinsky, and I want to do that same thing. I want to honor each of these carols as I would any of these other pieces. And so this book is both for scholars and musicians, experts and lay people, non-Ukrainians, and perhaps for Ukrainians as well. And I was laughing with a friend of mine the other day. In a way, I feel like that swallow, like that lastivochka, the little bird who calls out to say, maybe to people in Ukraine, look at all you have. Look at this. And also to say to non-Ukrainians, dang, will you look at what they have. So before I hand it over to my interlocutors, I'd like to share some thoughts on two phenomena that came to my attention as being extraordinary while researching this book. And one of the phenomena is strictly musical, and the other one has to do with the interplay of political history and carols. So to demonstrate the first phenomenon, I'm going to play a couple carols for you. And the first one is Jerusalemsky Dzwony, which is a carol that came out at the turn of the 20th century, and it's by Yakov Yatsenevich. And the 1920s were the turn of the 20th century was a fertile period for carol arranging, and it also coincided with a time of great ferment in Ukrainian history. The carol includes a refrain that refers explicitly to Shtedri Večer, and you'll hear that in the refrain of this carol. As soon as I can find the file that has this. Here it is. Okay. So you'll hear the choir sing Shtedri Večer, Dobry Večer, Dobrym Ludziom na Zdorowia. The verses of the carol are about the Virgin Mary who walks through a field and walks through an orchard field and gives birth to Jesus, which is an interesting image. And there are so many carols in Ukraine about Mary, and Ukrainians view Mary as not some sort of distant, perfect creature, but as someone who's very familiar, who could be walking through your orchard at any time or having dinner. This is the carol. It's called Jerusalemsky Dzwony, which means Jerusalem's bells. And you'll hear soon why it's called, it has the image of bells in it. And yeah, without further ado, here it is. This is an So what this carol obviously does, the way this composer arranged it, mimics the sounds of bells, the tintinnabulation of bells. And by the way, if you've never been to Ukraine, the way they ring bells there is different from the way they do at Westminster Cathedral. So it's really all about the little bells, the medium-sized bells, the big bells, and the rhythmic interaction of them. So that's what he has captured in this. Something to keep in mind is what Yasenevich had to work with was not all of that. I mean, he had that's it. That's what he had. That's the melody. Those are the words of the carol. And it was his inventiveness that added all this information around it. And this is a great example of this phenomenon that I wanted to share with you, is Ukrainian composers' ability and fascination with the capacity of a cappella choirs to sound like anything, to sound like an orchestra. I mean, here it's just a bell, but there are other pieces that mimic sounds in much more varied ways. When the Ukrainian Republic Choir was touring Europe in the 1920s, critics around in Paris, and you see this in reviews, that they wrote that this is a human orchestra. Who are these people? These amazing Ukrainians. It sounds like a human orchestra. And so this is a unique phenomenon that I think we Ukrainians may take for granted, but you don't find it in every culture. I'm going to play for you another example now, and it is the famous Nabo Izemna that every Ukrainian knows from childhood. You pop out of the womb, your first Christmas, you hear it. And again, it's actually not a folk carol. It was found in a bohlasnik, so it's a melody that came from probably about 300 years ago. But the composer Kirill Stetsenko made an arrangement of it. And I'll play for you the refrain, because it's in the refrain that you see the magic detail that Stetsenko uses. The lyrics of the refrain are, it's about how heaven and earth came together on Christmas Eve, when Christ was born. And it describes how it says, Christ is born, God was made incarnate, angels sing, kings greet, all bow down, shepherds play instruments, all proclaiming the miracle, chudo, chudo. What Stetsenko does is he uses the choir to in different configurations to paint each of those personages, or each of those groups of people or beings. So the angels, when the words come up that Angeles vivают, angels sing, the bass drops out. So you have mainly just the treble voices up there. The next phrase, where it's about the kings, the sopranos and altos drop out. So you just have these manly kings down there. And in fact, it's even more specific in that the male voices are divided into 3 voice parts. So it's the 3 kings. So you have that. And then you have this moment where it says, shepherds play instruments. And in that little phrase, I'd never noticed it before. The basses sing that, an octave lower than that, obviously. But, why? And often when you work with choirs, why do we have to work so hard? Basses don't like to be flexible. Why are we having to sing bum ba da 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 dum when we could just be singing bum 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 bum, simple rhythm? The reason is they're depicting shepherds playing instruments, shepherds riffing on things, on their klapsas or their bandure, and so that's why he inserts even that detail. And then there's my favorite detail in it, and it's favorite of mine because it's in the tenor voice, and my dad was a tenor. And at the very moment, the very beginning, when the choir sings, Christ is born, the tenors go a little wild. Ba, 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 Christos rodivся, jumping up a fourth and then down an octave and back. If you look in a hymnal in a Catholic church or Protestant church for choral arrangements, you don't see the tenors going nuts like that. It's mainly sort of scalar motion. And just all sing homophonically and go home and have some chicken soup. But here the tenors are jumping out of their skin. And I think the idea is that there's always that one shepherd who just is so excited, or one archangel that has to herald it out with a big trumpet or whatever. But for whatever reason, Stetsenko is that detailed. So here's the Lviv Chamber Choir Gloria, and singing this. I'll play for you. Oh, shoot. One verse. I'm going to do this. hands are shaking. I get excited. Here's the refrain. Listen for the tenor. Angels singing. Did you get all that? So whether you're in the choir in Ukrainian churches, at least the one I grew up in Ukraine, the choirs in the choir loft, the congregations below, typically the congregation sings along just on the melody. And when I was growing up, there were always some older women from villages who just, nah, boy, and we're singing along. And they might not have heard all that detail, but they would have loved it. And I think one of the reasons why this carol is so memorable and so entertaining and really captures our imagination is because there's all that detail in there that we might not see it in the score, but it's there. And I think of some of these carols, another metaphor, I'm sorry, I'm full of them today, a stained glass window, right? Stained glass windows or paintings were used in churches or icons so that people could see the story. Maybe they couldn't read, but they could see the biblical story. And so these composers used sounds to tell those stories, to give us the oral image of what was going on Christmas Eve, which is probably, it was pretty loud. We don't know, but angels singing, people singing together, probably a lot of hamir, a lot of stuff going on. Now here's a very different example of virtuosity, and this one is from a contemporary composer, Valentin Silvestrov. You'll hear what sounds like echo effects or lots of reverb. When you first hear this recording, you think, oh my heavens, they really overdid the reverb perhaps. But actually the reverb is built into the music score, which is extraordinary. So what Silvestrov does is he has the vocal parts overlap in such a way that the soprano soloist sings a note, and then the sopranos in the choir singing ah or ah sustain that note. And I think what he's doing is he's creating this image of the halo on Christmas Eve. This is Ticha Nich by Valentin Silvestrov, Silent Night. And here you go. I'll stop it there, but I think you get the image that Silvestrov is creating there, which is that on Christmas Eve, the light was magical. Another detail that he uses that I haven't seen in any other composer in any country is that when the choir is sustaining those chords, they're not all sustaining ah or ah. Half the singers sing ah, half of them sing ah, because he doesn't want to create a glaring light. Normally in choirs we want to match the vowel. All singers have to sing the same vowel, but here he's intentionally blurring it because the light of that Eastern star was not necessarily harsh. So overall, this phenomenon, the way Ukrainian composers manipulate the sound of a cappella choirs is quite extraordinary, and I think unparalleled in the world. The respect they give to a cappella choral singing is also very, very great, and the respect they give to the choirs is pretty good, and we hope it'll be even better with time. And now I'm going to pivot to the other topic for another 5 minutes, and that is the interplay of choral music with Ukraine's political history. Kirill Stitsenko, the composer whose carol you heard just a minute ago, was part of a phenomenon or a movement that I call choral activism. Stitsenko and his colleague Leontovich, together with Alexander Koshitz, another composer, conductor in Kiev, lived during the last decades of the Russian Empire, a time when the Russian Tsars and imperial society regarded Ukrainians as lesser, as little Russians. The Tsars had long suppressed the Ukrainian language, and beginning in the 1870s, didn't allow the publication of any book, play, poem, or music with Ukrainian words. Now, these composers were clever, and they found a way to circumvent this restriction. Maybe you can't publish choral music. Maybe you can't write really long things, but you can compose short choral pieces that can be easily copied by hand and taught to choirs by rote. And so that's what these composers did. And sometimes, often, these pieces they wrote would spread like wildfire in this process. They followed a method of choral activism developed by their mentor, Mykola Lysenko, who's known as the father of Ukrainian music. So their mentor gave them this formula. First, you go to villages. You transcribe folk songs and folk carols, verbatim, alliteratum, every note in detail. Lysenko believed that the lines of folk melody and the lines of lyrics were like the DNA, the essence of Ukrainian culture. So first you write down these melodies, then you create choral arrangements of these folk or village songs, then you organize choirs to sing those arrangements. You learn how to be a conductor, by the way, you have to conduct. And then you organize concert tours to perform these choral pieces across Ukraine. That was their mission. They did all of that. And by performing these songs across Ukraine, they mirrored back to Ukrainians their language and their identity. And they unified that language and that identity. And therefore, they preserved it. So this process of making short arrangements of folk song had been going on for decades with Lysenko and with his students. But Stitsenko was the first Ukrainian composer to give focused attention to carols. In 1907 to 10, he composed 50 arrangements of Christmas and New Year's carols. And you might say that in arranging these carols, he gave them official choral cred. You know, they weren't just supposed to be in villages anymore. They were going to be in churches and in the city. These arrangements that he wrote, 50 of them, caught the attention of Koshitz, who at the time was conducting a student choir at the university, the big university in Kiev. And Koshitz says, you know what? Why don't we have a Christmas concert? And in 1913, the very first Christmas concert ever took place in Kiev. And to remind you, Ukrainian words has been suppressed since the 1870s. They were still censored in the 1900s when Koshitz first took over that choir, the university choir. The officials told him, under no circumstances will your choir sing anything in Ukrainian. And yet, it's interesting that in 1913, there were these concerts, and it was an annual tradition for a while, until the Soviets took over, of course. But for several years, there were these concerts with carols, and they strengthened a sense of Ukrainian identity. And then a few years later, in 1919, they were used to assert Ukrainian identity outside Ukraine. The president of Ukraine, it was newly minted the country. It was vulnerable at the time. And he gathered these choral directors, these three people together, on January 2nd of 1919 and said, there's a world conference happening, peace conference. You have to put together the best singers in Ukraine and send them on a tour. And he thought these choral pieces could do the job because the political importance and effectiveness of choral music had already been established within Ukraine. So what may seem odd, that story, it's not at all. not odd at all, because it was so strong and powerful within the country, and he thought it could do the same internationally. After all, Petliura, in fact, had been a choral director when he was in seminary. You might not have known that, but he was. And he was kicked out because he programmed Ukrainian music. But he was in a way a part of this wave of choral activism. So in closing out, this phenomenon of choral activism wasn't just limited to the 1920s. It was hugely important then at the turn of the 20th century, but it has been used throughout. So for example, in the 1960s and 70s, the dissident poets and artists called the Шестидесятники, or the 60ers, gathered and sang carols brazenly and openly in streetcars, in public gatherings, to proclaim the language and to assert their identity as Ukrainians. In the 1940s, during and after World War II, refugees used carols for sustenance. And whether in DP camps or later after they settled in the diaspora, they published collection after collection of carol lyrics, published in Munich and Poland and Pittsburgh and Winnipeg and Saskatchewan. And there are hundreds of them. This very library here, by the way, has a couple dozen of them. And it speaks to the fact that, I mean, these people didn't have that much. You know, aren't you going to save your money to publish, Shevchenko poems? And they probably did. But alongside those poems, they felt these carols were hugely important. And before I totally leave this, especially because Monsignor Boris is here, His Excellency, I also need to note something that is obvious but needs to be stated. The sacred, the liturgical, the biblical nature of these carols also were profoundly strengthening to the Ukrainian people. So at the start of Russia's current war in Ukraine, one of the first clips that came out of Lviv was the Lviv Opera Chorus singing "Z nami Bog," God is with us, which is sung at Christmas time. So, and the composers that sang Leontovich, Koshitz they'd also gone to seminary. Leontovich and Stetsenko were priests. So they knew, and they were highly conscious of the fact that the nativity story and the core message of Christianity is subversive in and of itself, and it challenges autocracy. These carols state that Christ really was born and came to earth to turn things upside down, and these carols state that kings of the earth do not hold supreme power. So I will leave you with this, and now after the Q&A, I'd like to play for you one more carol as an example of the subversive nature of these lyrics.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview. As I told you, it's a really rigorous work of both history and musicology. So it's now my great honor, I'm going to invite His Excellency Boris Kudyak to offer some comments.
Good evening, Slava Isusu Christu. We're all, I think, particularly privileged today to be at this presentation. And I think on behalf of all of us, we would like to thank you, Marika, for the work, for this book, and for the lifetime of living music, of singing it, of teaching others, and of studying it. Why do I think this book is so important? I don't know if you ever were faced with this, but many times in the US, in the international church world, in Europe, whether it was articulated explicitly or just between the lines, I think I and many of us were labeled and put into a category. Well, you know, they're just the we got rhythm people. They're lyrical, sentimental, at best poetic and epic, but there's not much real critical narrative, rational expression and explanation, analysis. Ultimately, not that much thought. As late as the 1990s, I had a sense of prejudice about the possibility of Ukrainians having a Catholic university. In view, there were many Ukrainians who thought, well, we should just go to Poland, where there is Lublin, the Catholic university there. I'm speaking from a very personal place, and I will end with a very clearly personal moment. But I think it is something that comes out of the nature of our culture and the scale of values and power structure of modern Western society. At least from the Enlightenment, the rational was to reign. That rational was to bring us into progress and a bright future. We were going to identify the laws of nature, and whether it's economy or society, culture, education, transport, industry, medicine, we were going to use our rational capability to bring people to a bright future. One of those promising that kind of trajectory, one of the ideas and ideologies was communism. The Western world entered the 20th century with this kind of rationalistic, positivistic certainty about progress. And the many tragedies that Marika brings to the attention of the readership of these kind of books, musicians particularly, the tragedy of our Ukrainian people is actually a result of this great belief in progress. Both communism and fascism were systems that were deeply convinced of their program. What does this say about this book? Why do I say this at the presentation of a book on carols and sacred hymns from Ukraine? It is my deep conviction that the Ukrainian genius for song is our great contribution, not only of the past, but for the future. I had the privilege on December 8th, 2013, to speak to the 1 million people in the Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity. It just so happened to be the feast of St. Clement on the old calendar, and it was the 50th anniversary when Joseph Slipi announced the creation of the Ukrainian Catholic University. But my argument before, on that day, and after regarding Ukraine's association with Europe was that we need to go to Europe not only with an outstretched begging hand, but we need to make a contribution. And when I express this in interviews, people say, well, what is Ukraine going to give? Well, I think today many people realize that Ukraine has helped salvage the hope for a European Union. just a few years ago, the skepsis about the European Union led to Brexit. Some Eastern partners, Poland, Hungary, were flirting also with the idea of separating away. In 2014, living in Paris, I could see the skepsis of a whole generation of European young people who looked at their age group in Kyiv and throughout Ukraine and asked, why are these people willing to risk so much for the flag of the European Union? Today, Ukraine has, through the sacrifice of its blood, has forged the North Atlantic defense system. NATO is stronger than ever with 2 new members. But I said then, and I say now, that I think song will also be a contribution of Ukraine. Song of a vital, live, not virtual, not AI voice. All of the virtuality, all of the artificial intelligence, all of the gifts of recordings and synthesis of music has its place. But there is nothing that replaces yours and my participation in a carol, in a song, in a choir. Marika and her brother, Olis, are not only very fruitful musicians, but they're very merciful people. I had the privilege to sing in a choir that Marika conducted. And her mercy was to people like me, who are only modestly endowed with musical talent. And even people like me sing carols. In fact, most days I sing for 2 hours every day. For an hour and a half to 2 hours of morning and an evening prayer. It is a big, big part of my life to sing. Marika, correct me if I'm wrong, you said there are thousands of carols. Somewhere I read about studies of folk musicology that of all the European peoples, Ukrainians have by far the greatest number of folk songs, something like 800,000.
I defer to
I don't
my
want to get into that kind of
I don't know,
calculation.
but it's, you know, it's not mine is bigger or whatever. The question is, it is rich, this tradition.
Can I respond to that? I would say 2 things. One is that there were articles written by people traveling through Ukraine from Germany and England, and they remarked on that, how traveling through Ukraine, one of the things they noticed was just how much singing was going on. The other thing is, a few years ago, a Ukrainian scholar wrote me an email and said, I mean, I hate to even almost repeat this, but it's like, Ukrainians have carols, but Russians don't. And I said, I'm not comfortable saying that. But when I was researching this book, I did find this, that when I looked in Soviet encyclopedias of music, and then later on after the breakup of the Soviet states, now there's a Russian encyclopedia of music, there is a listing in each of those, even during the Soviet era, for koletki, but there's no listing for shtedrivki. So perhaps we can say that shtedrivki, these carols that are more based in earthiness and gratitude and generosity, perhaps that is unique to Ukraine.
the argument I'm making is not uniqueness or great competition, but it's one of identity and treasure. It is part of our identity and part of our treasure. But as you said in this Oxford Book of Carols, this legacy is absent, as has been much of our legacy. This book brings this legacy to a global public. The unusualness of it will be precisely a source of its popularity. It will not be for the narrow specialist. I want to encourage you to buy multiple copies of this book and make it your Christmas present. It will be a very original, apropos, and appreciated Christmas present. It will be something that you can open every conversation with at Christmas parties. You heard the Carol of the Bells? You want to know more about it? This is my Christmas present for you. I'm going to do that. I used all the cash I had to buy four books downstairs. That's what book presentations are for as well. But Marika Kuzma has spent a lifetime in the depth of these springs, in this water of melody, of harmony, of music that is not only notes or sounds, but it is the life and soul of a people. My modest musical talents come from my mother, which did not keep her from singing as she cooked in her kitchen. My mother died 6 years ago, and in the last years of her life, she had progressive dementia. And it was not easy to communicate, but we could sing together. And when we sang, the words were there. There's something very deep about that. Something that argues for the spirit, because it comes from the spirit. And finally, I just would want to say that this great gift that you give us, Marika, is a challenge to theologians. I don't know, maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't think there has been kind of a systematic analysis of the material that you give us from a theological point of view. And that is something that I'm sure will happen after your book gets around. So thank you so much. And we look forward to what comes next.
Yakuyu, thank you so much. So we're going to pivot towards the Q&A portion, so you can start thinking about the questions that you might want to pose. I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator to say a few words here. And I think I partly want to respond to some of what was just said, which is true, right? This stereotype of Ukrainians as especially songful has been a longstanding stereotype, and therefore the absence of Ukrainian song from global knowledge is striking. The fact of Ukrainians as being extremely musical also has led people to believe that Ukrainians are very sentimental, are emotional, are poetic, exactly the words that you were describing. And inside of the academy where I spend most of my life, for better or worse, that has also often led to a kind of dismissiveness of Ukraine. And I was really struck, and you sort of do, I read the footnotes, because that's also a thing I do as a scholar. And there's a footnote where you say there was a conference at Berkeley where a historian put a stack of books on the lectern and said, Ukrainian history is too complex to be instructive. Too complex to be instructive. So on the one hand, so complex that it can't even be instructive. And on the other hand, so musical that it can't be taken seriously, right? And I think that this kind of like double problem, that on the one hand, Ukrainians are depicted as sort of non-serious, and on the other hand, it's too complex, which is another way to dismiss, has been a longstanding problem. And that is one of the reasons why this book is so valuable, because you never shy away from the ways in which music, and the song archive in particular, has operated as a refusal to accept that narrative. So this is powerfully done not only in the moment of choral activism, where we see the musical and political very strategically deployed together, and I'm so grateful for that term, by the way, choral activism. We should all be talking about Ukrainian choral activism. But we see it also in more subtle ways, right, before the 19th century, and certainly through the Soviet 20th and 21st century, into the 21st, the post-Soviet. So I am going to pose the first question, and then depending on how many hands shoot up in the room, I will pose the second question. We shall see. Okay. So my question is, I would just invite you to talk a little bit about the relationship between the sacred and the secular, and the kind of blurriness there. So I'm thinking both about the ways that you've already talked a little bit about the Shchedryivka as this almost ambiguous kind of song, but also I'm thinking about in the 21st century, Ostap Manulak's distinction between, I'm going to forget the phrase exactly, but I have it bookmarked here for easy. So Ostap Manulak comes up with a topology that he describes as secular music with sacred symbolism, right? So again, this kind of almost blurriness between those categories. I'm also thinking, and maybe you could touch on this if you want to, but about the Soviet project of actually banishing the sacred from the repertoire of Ukrainian song, and what that meant for these repertoires as well. What did that look like? Did it involve the changing of texts, which was so often done under the Soviet rule? So that's my first question, and then I know we already have questions in the room. Okay.
I think there are 3 questions in there, but I'll try to do that. But I love them all, so thank you. I'll go to Ostap Manulak's thing first, because that's what first hits me. So he, it's again, because I'm not in Ukraine, I feel that I need to defer to how people express themselves about music in Ukraine right now. And this composer, he's actually a composer, but he wrote his dissertation on topologies of music, or different kinds of categories of music. And he came up with this term of secular music with sacred symbolism. And I think that that's interesting, because I think when sacred music came back to Ukraine, or even in the case of these, the dissidents who sang carols, it was in part to say, yes, religion has been suppressed, and so we're religious people, but it's also to say that these sacred texts have been part of our culture, and we were denied these texts for 70 years, and we didn't have access to them. So whether these current composers call themselves Christians or not, they value the words of the liturgy. They value the symbolism of the liturgy, and they embrace them because it's part of Ukraine's past. Lesya Dichko, by the way, this composer who celebrated her 85th birthday, I think it was last week, phenomenal composer. I'm going to play her one of her carols as an outtake. But I've talked with her on several occasions. She told me that in the 1980s, she wrote the first liturgy in a long time, and she was sort of allowed to do this in the 1980s with the coming of the millennium of Christianity. But she said that she could not find a copy of the liturgy texts in the 1980s, nowhere in Kyiv. I mean, Kyiv was the seat of the church. That's where the baptism of Ukraine happened, in Kyiv, right? But you couldn't find any of these words. She had to smuggle them in from Canada in order to write these words. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is, I think when these composers talk about secular music with sacred imagery, I think it's them reclaiming that as part of their heritage and their history. I had the great fortune of attending the first sacred music conference in Ukraine since the 19-teens, which took place in 1997. And there was such excitement, such ferment, because they'd been denied it for so long. And they literally had conversations like, well, should we allow saxophones to play in the sacred music? So there was that much interest and excitement. So anyway, that's to that question. And also, I think composers like Silvestrov, there's so much I could say. the choral director, I must give a shout out to the Kyiv Chamber Choir because its director, why am I blanking out on his name right now? Hobdich, Mikola Hobdich, was very instrumental in bringing sacred music back. And I think it was in 2001, he had this competition. Any young composer compose a setting of psalms, and whoever wins the prize will record it. And so all these young composers composed psalm settings, and it got them interested in sacred texts. So I just want to say that also composers don't just compose in a vacuum. They can only compose these things if there's a choir to sing it. And choirs like the Kyiv Chamber Choir, Dumka, so many choirs in Kyiv keep this music alive. What was your other question? Oh, well, sacred secular. Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
but really what I want you to talk about, I think, is the Soviet. Like, what was that? What did that look like in the context of these sounds in terms of trying to scrub the religion, the sacred, out of these repertoires?
Well, there was a quote when the Soviets first came in power. I can't remember who it was who said it. We will purge the Soviet Union of the word God within 5 years. So it was that extreme. So they wanted to get rid of all of that. And all holidays. You can't celebrate Christmas or New Year's Eve or anything. But they discovered after a while that these workers, this proletariat, they needed holidays. You have to celebrate something in the middle of winter. So they allowed for winter holidays. And they also knew you couldn't quite purge these carols because they were so known, especially in Ukraine. A carol like Nova Radistala that I hope to play for you in a second. So what they did was they either arrested people, and there was, I couldn't document it, but I heard a story that in Lviv, if children were caught caroling in the street, their parents would be punished and imprisoned. So it was that stark. But what they also did was, it was sort of like, if you can't beat them, join them. They rewrote the lyrics of some of these carols. So for example, Dobry večer tobie, pane hospodarju, which is one of the big carols in Ukraine, good evening to you, master of the house, was changed into Dobry večer tobie, vilni proletar, which means, good evening to you, freed proletariat. And then the carol Nova Radistala was changed from a bright star has shone over, has illumined the world. They changed it to a 5-pointed red star has illumined the world. So the Soviets, they felt very threatened by carols because they knew you couldn't snuff it out. So that's to that, yeah.
Thank you. That was actually the payoff I was hoping for with that question. So thank you so much for that. So I do have so many other questions that I would ask you, but I know I will have the privilege to ask you in a future setting. So we're going to open it to the room now. And I know you've been waiting. And Marika, I don't know, would you prefer just to call on people as you wish, or do you want me to do that job for you? Okay, fine. So I invite you first.
Thank you. In the 1990s, WQXR, during Christmas season, played Russian carols. And all I heard were Ukrainian carols, and one was a poem by Skoroboda. I don't remember that. I have a question. I have a beloved carol, Neni Adame, which is very deep and really you want to meditate. It's a very reflective. I find Sylvester's example you gave also a type that's very reflective. Would you know when was that composed or put together?
Nini Adame or the Sylvester?
Neni Adame.
I don't know that one actually. I couldn't tell you. I would have to look that up because
it goes from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
That's my next book. But I do want to say, because I'm so desperate to play this at the end of the hour, the Nova Radistala is also an example of this kind of carol, which I think non-Ukrainians often find to be very unusual because it's slow, it's in a minor mode. How can this be? New joy has come into the world, but it reflects Ukraine's sense that this is a new kind of joy. It's not just everyday slap happy joy. It's a more profound one. And I think maybe Adame falls into that category. Any other question?
I have a question about terminology. So there's no word in English for so there is no separate word between kolядки and щедрівки. We call both of them carols. And I was just wondering if there is, if it would make sense to kind of create a term for this, because, for example, I'm translating texts and about Ukrainian composers, and it would say he wrote kolядки and щедрівки, so I just have to say just carols. But is there, because to me it seems like they're kind of different genres, that one is more sacred and another is more secular, and for different occasions, would it make sense to think about the different term? If it's specifically Ukrainian genre that doesn't exist anywhere else, then we should probably have a term for it.
Well, actually, your question intersects with one of her first question. It is hard to translate these things. That's why I wrote the book, because there's no equivalent. There is no Shtedri Večer in American or Western European culture. They have wassailing songs. The Brits have that, or Twelfth Night songs. The way I used it in the book is Christmas carols and New Year's carols. It's that, which is very imperfect. Or people will also say Epiphany carols, but I think that's confusing to people, because for most Americans, at least, Epiphany means three kings, and they really have nothing to do with three kings at all. I mean, if anything, there's theophany, and then there's also Shtedri Večer being a celebration of gratitude. So if anything, I mean, we can talk about this, the three of us maybe together. Gratitude carols.
Yes, I was gonna say. I don't know if I need the microphone, and I'm sorry, I'm stepping out of my role here, but I agree that it would be useful to have a distinction here, because I actually think the Щедрівка does have a different function. And the only issue I have with New Year's carols is that then it covers over the archaic old New Year, the spring part of the story, which to me is so interesting, right? And I think to many of us. So I really like the idea of like gratitude songs. There's some generosity songs. Yeah, I mean something around that.
Not being an expert, but allow me to maybe suggest. I'm not sure that saying that carols are, let's say more religious and Szczeдрівки are secular, really respects the quality of the relationship. The division of religious and secular is something very modern, which flows out of Western culture. And it would not, I think, have dawned on people singing Szczeдрівки that this was not something divine. So maybe it's better to use the words, I don't know,
Nature-based.
Yeah, naturalistic or something like that. And they're both transcendent. There's I think one of the big challenges of contemporary culture is the meaninglessness. 21% of Americans today are suffering from mental illness, from anxieties, from depression, and from all kinds of addictions. Drugs, alcohol, pornography, computers, social media. A lot of young people, 20% of teenage girls, have seriously considered suicide. There's people need meaning, and they need meaning that is holistic, that is not kind of separated in constant war. In this election that we're having, it's not, the candidates are only a symptom of what is deep in the culture. It's these separations. And what carols did, what Kolyady and Szczeдрівки did, is it, щоб землю з небом одно злучити. It's very integrating and very healing.
It's so strange to be interrupting you about that, but yes, and I totally agree. And I was asking my friend Penny, who's a dear friend from California visiting, that I'm a fan of Richard Rohr, this theologian, and I was reading one of his daily meditations, and it talked about how actually the first scripture of God is nature, is creation, and that the Bible, it's both are religious topics, both are sacred. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true, that in Ukraine, I like to think of these carols as being, it's more like a Venn diagram. It's not like a strict distinction. I mean, the Jerusalemski Zvane, which has the refrain, Shtedri Večer, Dobri Večer, talks about the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus. So it's not like, yes, it's for Epiphany Eve, yes, it's for that celebration, but they're also singing about that. I also think, and then Virlana Tkac I see out there, who's brought these wonderful people from the Carpathian Mountains, the Hutsule, and their rituals are so, they wed together pre-Christian and Christian rituals. And the idea was, unless you carol to every house, spring will not come. And there's this reverence for nature that is, because God and nature are not separate. So I think that, I mean, that's another challenge to categorizing this. And I also think that Ukraine, by its nature, heaven and earth, the flag of Ukraine is earth and heaven working together. And that's why this symbolism also in that carol of like heaven and, you know, the angels and humans singing together, that's real for Ukrainians. That really happened. And so there is this belief in the spirituality of singing, and that singing takes us into this transcendent divine realm. So I think they're both divine. I mean, all of these carols are divine in their own way and sacred in their own way. Just some of them have more biblical texts. Oh, by the way, I would say that Koshitz wrote a book about, that defined it as, okay, we have hymns, we have kolet, there are also carols, koletki, that you would never sing in church, like Dobri Večer Tobi. You don't sing that going to communion, because that's more, and he called those koletki za stolom, carols at the table, koletki v cerkvi, you know, and carols in church, and then shtedriuki. So, but they all overlap so much. Okay, I think, yes, please.
Well, I was just going to point out that we started with a simple seeming question about terminology and ended up at heaven and earth and everything in between. But I think this is an ongoing conversation that should be had, and I respect the idea, right, that maybe making too clear a distinction wouldn't be helpful in this case. So I'm just thinking that we have a little bit of time left for questions, and then we will welcome people to purchase 4 copies of the book each. Okay, yes.
And I will play that carol before I exit. So.
Oh yes, great. So I think in the back.
Yeah. Another question, anyone? Oh yeah.
Дякую за дуже цікаву розмову, Юрія Мельченко. Хотів спитати вас, чи щось ви дізналися про танці? Did you learn anything about dance as you wrote this book? Thank you.
Oh, that's a very interesting and very simple, I have a simple answer for you. No, he was asking me if in the course of researching this book, if I researched or learned anything about dances. And no, that's the only thing I can say, but але дякую за питання, дякую, властиво ні, нічого, але я обмежила себе лише до що я через голос, а не через ноги, але дякую за питання. I just said I limited myself to talking about only the things that come through the voice and not through the feet. But thank you. Anything else? Yes.
Я хотіла вас запитати, чи ви включили в свою книжку сучасні коляди, авторські, і як ви до того ставитеся? Бо я чула коляди, які мали характер коляди, скажімо, структура чи щось таке. Але є також такі коляди, які нагадують напівтанго або значить, як звучить коляда, значить, як я не є експерт також в композиції, але повинно щось бути, щоб
klasa pytanie, bo ja tu
Sure,
napisałam.
sure.
Yes, I know that you're perfectly capable of asking the question, which is a question about contemporary carols and whether they're featured in the book, but specifically also about авторские, so how self-authored or like very creative kind of expanded versions of the carols. The questioner, who is my aunt, contemporary carols can sound like a tango, or they're using quarter tones, and that the question is, how should we view the kind of constraints around what is recognizably a carol, so that it kind of looks and smells and sounds like a carol?
So there are no tangos in the book. But I mean, one thing is I limited myself to choral carols, so things that would be sung by choirs. So I didn't go into what one finds on a lot of about contemporary carols. And I would say, I'm not sure which you're asking about. So there are contemporary carols as in pop carols, pop music. And then there are also contemporary carols by composers trained at conservatory. So I'll say I never went into the pop area. However, there is one carol that the Picardisca Tercia wrote and recorded, which is a sort of a pop crossover group. It's a kind of a boy band in a way, but they sing strictly a cappella. And Volodymyr Yakimets composed it. It's not an original carol. All of that. So I would say that I is from a composer that composed something 2 years ago. So I did want to include something that was really until the present day, something that was composed at the turn of the 20th century. And I would say that composers, boy, they have such imaginations, and I would never want to limit it. And we always have a choice if we want to hear it or not. And I love that Leszek Dyczko, I remember the first time I recorded some pieces by Leszek Dyczko, and my aunt said, I hate this. I don't like these harmonies at all. These chords don't make sense. Leszek Dyczko is a real fan of polychords and these kind of, what do you call it, clusters, play with quarter tones. So I think it's part of maybe some village practice. So I would say that, I would never want to put a limit on what composers can or cannot do. But for this book, I wanted to limit it to things that choirs could sing, classically trained. And I didn't even get into the whole narodny, limited myself to. Dobre? So dobre. Yeah. Oh, question over there?
Yeah, I have a question. Somebody who understands Ukrainian, you were in Ukraine this summer, but my question is, how do you listen to these songs if you can't read music?
Ha! Sorry, it's an emphatic answer. You can't, but I have a discography in there, and in the discography I actually list, this carol can be heard on this track recorded by this choir, but also I'm in the process of editing a recording of many of these carols. So last June, I got together a group of aims for a Grammy Award, but whether it gets that or not, at least I think it will be something that people can refer to. Yeah. So, but the last carol I'm going to play for you is actually from our recording that no one has heard yet. So you can hear that.
Shall we take one last question, and then we will listen to the long-awaited song? So we'll welcome this question.
I was particularly intrigued by this whole concept that was being discussed tonight about what Ukraine has given, right? And there's individuals going into Ukraine or supporting Ukraine right now, thinking that we are being the gift, right? And yet, I believe that if you've done that work as a non-Ukrainian, you realize that you are the one receiving the gift. And I'm curious in that discussion tonight what's happened for the EU and me buying 4 books. And I will be sending it to the Anthology Society that I love up in Boston, etc. If I can afford more in cash tonight, I will be buying more than 4. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there more of a thread of that discussion in this book? Is there another place to discover it?
Oof, that's a whole other topic. Before I forget, I ordered 24 credit at a discount here that you won't get by buying a single copy elsewhere. I'm very happy to take down a list of names with email addresses, and then we can communicate, and I can find a way to send you the copy later, just so I don't forget. and this question about, Ukraine takes, and what does it give back? Well, for God's sakes, it's been feeding the world for years. It's the breadbasket of Europe. I mean, the grain, I don't have the statistics. It feeds 400 million people. So that's a big gift right there. And the other thing I would say is Ukraine's been giving a lot. It's just it hasn't been allowed to give more. So in terms of the music, this music is phenomenal and nobody knows about it. And this gift is something that they tories around the world. And the way they respect a cappella music is exemplary. And I could go on and on, but it's such a stark difference to me. You go to a clever composed for choir who didn't respect it at all. You could graduate there without knowing how to compose for voices at all. In Kiev, in Ukraine, first of all, they all have to go to villages to listen to village songs. It's a requirement. It's a prerequisite for composers. You have to hear these melodies. It's also a prerequisite to consent. Jeffrey Duma, he's the choral director at Yale, the Yale Glee Club, and he said, is it okay if I use those same scores for incoming conducting students who are looking to study conducting at Yale to do as their audition piece? So once you share this with people, Grant Gershon, when I sent him this piece by Irina Alexichuk, was just blown away. Craig Hella Johnson, who's a big choral director, Ukraine has so many gifts to give. It just hasn't been allowed to, and now hopefully the floodgates will start to open.
Thank you so much. So Marika is the preeminent choral activist of the 21st century, and we are all called now to become choral activists as well. As you're queuing up this song, here's what I would propose. I would propose that we give Dr. Kuzma a huge round of applause, but hold on for one moment, and then we will listen together, and then we invite you for further informal conversation. The listening will be the last thing we do together. How does that sound?
I think music should have the last word.
Great. So right now we're going to have our roaring round of applause.
A while ago, I was talking about how Ukrainian carols have empowered the Ukrainian people for centuries. Composers and singers have recognized the ability of carols to comfort and strengthen the afflicted. And liturgical hymns like Zname Boch express faith in God. Kolitke, that praise the newborn king, Shchedrivke, that express gratitude for the bounty and beauty of the earth. All of those point us to a higher power and are all subversive to autocracy. All of them are empowering to humanity. And so to close, I've forgotten your name, that's pointed out that this carol, when you first hear it, it's minor mode, it's slow. How can this be about joy? But it talks to how the joy, it's arranged by Kirill Stitsenko. The first verse states, a new joy has come, praised in the heavens. A bright star above the manger has illumined the whole world. The second verse describes the shepherds kneeling before Tsarya Boha. The word for king in Ukrainian is tsar, or czar, as we know. So king, tsar, tsaryu, heavenly shepherd. Some people translate that word as shafayu, but shepherd or heavenly creator, give years of good fortune to this home. So the words amplify the message that this God, not an earthly or oppressive tsar, but a creator, a good shepherd. And in times of acute strife, Ukrainians sometimes adapt and add verses to that to make carols appropriate to the moment. So at the end of the third verse, you will hear an added couplet, and the words are give freedom, good fortune, and good Novaradi Stala. You'll hear it first as an unvarnished melody, and then its arrangement by Stitsenko. The soloist is Brian Dorset, and the choir is Ensemble Cherubim.
For being here. Thank you so much, Marika, for writing this book.
Yes.